In a world of dust and desperation, a whisper can be louder than a gunshot. For one man, a single sentence would unravel his past and rewrite his future, turning a simple horse trade into a reckoning that would echo across the Wyoming plains. What makes a man risk everything for a stranger? And how can a memory, buried for a decade, rise from the grave with the glint of tarnished silver? Before we dive into this tale of loss and redemption, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now, settle in, pour yourself something warm, and support the channel by letting this story of the Untamed West unfold. The air in Rawlings, Wyoming, tasted of grit and opportunity. A fine dust that settled on everything, the sweat-stained hats of tired men, the cracked leather of saddles, and the bottom of every whiskey glass. It was 1875, and the town was a nerve center of commerce and sin. A place where a man's fortune could be made on the turn of a card or the sale of a fine horse. Today, the prize was a magnificent Andalusian stallion, its coat the color of polished coal, its eyes wild with a fire that matched the untamed land. A crowd of merchants, their city clothes looking foolish and out of place, haggled with a rancher named Elias Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard sun and harder bargains. Standing off to the side, holding the stallion's lead, was Caleb. He was a man chiseled from the prairie itself, broad-shouldered and quiet, with eyes the color of a stormy sky that rarely betrayed the ghosts that haunted them. 10 years a cowboy, 5 years a ranch hand for Thorne. He'd learned the art of fading into the background. His past was a locked room, and he'd long ago thrown away the key. His job was simple: handle the horses, take his pay, and drink enough to keep the memories at bay. The deal was nearly done. The merchants had offered a price that made even Thorne's greedy eyes gleam. But it wasn't just money. They'd brought something else to trade, a piece of property they'd acquired from a band of outlaws they'd paid for safe passage. A girl. She stood beside their wagon, tethered by a rope around her wrist as if she were livestock. She was no older than 17, her dress torn and filthy, her face smudged with dirt and fear. But beneath the grime, there was a fierce defiance in the set of her jaw. Her eyes, wide and terrified, scanned the coarse faces of the men appraising her, men who saw her as nothing more than a bonus, a trifle to sweeten the pot. Her name, they'd said, was Mara. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd seen a lot of ugly things in his life, but the casual cruelty of this transaction curdled his stomach. Thorne, seeing the deal solidified, gestured for Caleb to bring the stallion forward. As he passed the girl, her eyes locked with his. They weren't pleading for a hero. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, searching for any chance, however slim. The merchants were laughing, one of them reaching out to grab her arm. As Caleb drew level with her, she took a half-step closer, her voice so low it was little more than a breath of air, lost in the noise of the town. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please don't sell me for a horse." The words were a gut punch, a stark plea that cut through his carefully constructed apathy. But it wasn't the words that broke him. It was what he saw as she moved. Her frayed collar shifted, revealing a necklace that lay against her collarbone. It was a simple thing, a silver pendant on a leather cord, tarnished with age and neglect. The world stopped. The haggling voices, the restless stomping of the horse, the Wyoming wind. It all went silent. Caleb's gaze fixed on the pendant. It was a bird, a vulture, carved with crude but distinctive detail. One of its tiny garnet eyes was missing, an imperfection he knew as well as the scars on his own hands. He felt the ground rush up to meet him. His knees buckled, the stallion's lood slipping through his numb fingers. A collective gasp went through the crowd as the ranch hand, the silent, sturdy Caleb, collapsed in the dust. The prized horse, startled, reared back with a panicked whinny. But Caleb didn't see it. He saw a different time, a different place. A sun-drenched porch on a small homestead. He saw himself, a boy of 15, carving a matching pendant for his little sister, Lily, on her 10th birthday. He remembered her laughter as she pointed out the one-eyed bird, declaring it was their special secret. He remembered the fire, the screams, the night the bandits came and took everything. The night they took her. He pushed himself up, his hands shaking, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The men were staring, Thorne's face a mask of fury and confusion. But Caleb only had eyes for the girl, for Mara, for the impossible ghost standing before him, wearing his sister's necklace. In that moment, the locked room in his soul burst open. The ghosts didn't just whisper, they roared. And in the heart of that storm, a single, unbreakable vow was forged. He didn't know how. He didn't have a plan. But as he met Mara's terrified, confused gaze, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let them take his sister again. The world snapped back into focus with the sting of dust in Caleb's lungs. Thorne was shouting his name, a string of curses that painted the air blue. The merchants were trying to calm the spooked Andalusian, their urban awkwardness turning the situation into a clumsy, dangerous dance. For a fleeting second, everyone's attention was on the horse. It was the only opening he would get, a decade of instinct, honed on cattle drives and saloon brawls, took over. Caleb didn't think. He moved. He scrambled to his feet, his collapse forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so potent it felt like ice in his veins. He lunged not for Mara, but for the hitching post where the merchant's own horses were tied. With a single savage slash of the pocket-knife he always carried, he cut the reins of their two best mounts. A sharp slap to their rumps sent them bolting, adding to the chaos. "The horses!" one of the merchants shrieked, his greed momentarily outweighing his interest in the girl. That was the moment. Caleb spun around, his eyes locking on Mara. She was frozen, her expression a maelstrom of fear and bewilderment. The man who had just collapsed in the dirt was now a whirlwind of focused violence. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't explain. He grabbed the rope that bound her wrist and sliced it clean. "Come on," he snarled, the words rough, urgent. He seized her arm, pulling her along with him. For a moment, she resisted, her body stiff with shock. Who was this man? What was happening? But the raw certainty in his grip, the sheer force of his will, left no room for argument. He was her only alternative to the leering merchants, a sudden terrifying storm that had just eclipsed the one she was already in. She stumbled after him, her worn-out boots struggling to find purchase in the churned-up dirt. Caleb's horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dusty, was tethered nearby, forgotten in the commotion over the stallion. He was a plain, dependable creature, the opposite of the flashy Andalusian, and in that moment, Caleb had never been more grateful for his calm demeanor. He vaulted into the saddle with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent half his life on horseback. He didn't pause. He reached down, his arm a steel band around Mara's waist, and hauled her up behind him. She landed awkwardly, her breath knocked out of her, her arms instinctively flying around his waist to keep from falling. She could feel the hard, unyielding muscle of his back, smell the scent of leather, sweat, and the dust of the earth that seemed to cling to him. Thorne finally realized what was happening. His face, already red with anger, turned a shade of purple. "Caleb, you son of a bitch! That's my property!" It was unclear if he meant the girl or the time he was losing to recapture the stallion. Caleb didn't look back. He dug his heels into Dusty's flanks, and the buckskin exploded into a gallop. They shot through the edge of the crowd, scattering onlookers who leaped out of the way with curses and shouts. The sounds of the trading post, Thorn's bellows of rage, the merchant's cries of betrayal, began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic thunder of hooves and the whistle of the wind past their ears. Mara clung to him, her face pressed against his back. The world was a blur of brown and green. She risked a glance over her shoulder. 3 men were on horseback now, fanning out from the town. They were coming after them. The chase had begun. They rode hard, pushing Dusty to his limit. Caleb didn't follow the main road. He cut across the open prairie, his internal compass guiding him toward the broken, rugged country to the east, a land of canyons and arroyos where a man could disappear if he was smart, or die if he was foolish. He rode with a grim, forward-leaning intensity, his body moving in perfect sync with the horse. For the first time, Mara felt a sliver of something other than terror. It was a fragile, unspoken thing. This man, this stranger, had thrown away his life for her. He had seen something in her or on her, that had transformed him from a passive ranch hand into a rescuer. She didn't understand it. She didn't know his name. But as they fled, a single unit of man, woman, and horse against the vast, empty landscape, a fragile alliance was forged in the heart of their desperate flight. It was an alliance built not on words or understanding, but on shared peril and the simple, primal fact that for now, his back was the only shield she had against the world. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brass-colored sky. The initial adrenaline of the escape had burned away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the gnawing ache of thirst. The Wyoming prairie stretched out before them, an endless ocean of sagebrush and rock, beautiful in its own brutal way, but utterly indifferent to their survival. The distant shouts of their pursuers had long since vanished, but Caleb knew it was a temporary reprieve. Men like Thorn and the merchants didn't forgive a public humiliation or a financial loss. They would be relentless. Caleb pushed Dusty onward, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the landscape for tracks, for water, for shelter. He was in his element here. The harshness of the wilderness didn't intimidate him. It was a language he understood. He led them into a series of rolling, broken hills that offered more cover than the open plains, the horse's hooves kicking up puffs of ochre dust. Mara's arms still circled his waist, but the death grip had loosened. Her fear was now layered with exhaustion. Every jolt of the horse sent a fresh wave of pain through her bruised body. She watched the back of Caleb's neck, the way the muscles tensed and relaxed, the way he seemed to be a part of the horse, an extension of the wild land itself. She saw him check the sun's position, his gaze sweeping the terrain with an unnerving competence. He was a man with a purpose, even if she was still a mystery to herself. By late afternoon, Dusty began to falter. The horse's gait became uneven, its breathing labored. Caleb slowed him to a walk, patting the sweat-slicked neck with a calloused hand. "Easy, boy. Almost there." He led them to a shallow, rocky wash, barely a scar on the land, but it was enough to hide them from casual view. He slid from the saddle, his movements stiff. When he turned to help Mara down, she practically fell into his arms, her legs too weak to hold her. He steadied her for a moment, his hands on her upper arms. The contact was brief, impersonal, but it was the first time they had faced each other since the chaos of the town. Her wide, hazel eyes searched his, full of unspoken questions. He looked away first, his gaze dropping to the silver vulture pendant that rested against her throat. The sight of it sent another jolt through him, a mix of pain and fierce, protective resolve. He pulled his canteen from the saddle. "Just a little," he said, his voice raspy from dust and disuse. "We have to make it last." She drank greedily at first, then caught herself, handing it back to him with more than half remaining. The small act of discipline, of consideration, did not go unnoticed. He took a short swig himself and then poured a small, precious amount into his hat for Dusty, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The chill of the high desert evening descended. They had no fire, no food, no blankets, only the clothes on their backs, and one weary horse. The shared hardship became a silent conversation between them. He found a small overhang in the rock, a shallow cave that would offer some protection from the wind. He gestured for her to sit. She huddled inside, wrapping her arms around her knees, shivering. Caleb stood guard at the mouth of the small shelter, a stark silhouette against the fading light, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He was still a stranger, still a figure of grim intensity, but his presence was no longer just a source of fear. It was a shield. "They'll have dogs," she said, her voice quiet, startling the silence. Caleb didn't turn. "Maybe, but the rock makes it hard to track. The wind will pick up after dark. It'll cover our scent." His confidence was reassuring, but it didn't warm her. She watched him. This man who was her captor and her savior all at once. She saw him discreetly touch his own neck, right below his jawline. It was an unconscious gesture, one of pain or memory. A wary trust, fragile as a spider's thread, began to spin itself between them in the deepening twilight. They were two hunted animals, their survival now inextricably linked. He was saving her for a reason she didn't understand, and she was following him because she had no other choice. In the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the prairie, they were all each other had. The moon rose, a sliver of bone white in an ink-black sky, and the temperature plummeted. The wind howled through the wash, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to seep into their bones. Mara shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering despite her efforts to stay quiet. Caleb, who had been standing sentinel, finally turned and entered the shallow cave. The space was small, forcing a proximity that felt both dangerous and necessary. He sat down a few feet from her, the rifle resting across his knees. For a long time, the only sounds were the wind and her shivering. He was a wall of silence, his face lost in the shadows, but she could feel his gaze on her. "You'll freeze," he said, his voice a low rumble. He shuffled closer, and, without any ceremony, draped his heavy duster coat over her shoulders. The canvas was stiff and smelled of horse and rain, but it carried his body heat. The warmth was immediate, a shocking comfort that made her want to weep. She pulled the coat tighter around herself. "Thank you." The simple words hung in the air. The shared warmth, the enforced intimacy of their shelter, seemed to lower the barriers between them. Now was the time. He had to ask. He had to know. "The necklace," he said, his voice strained. "Where did you get it?" Mara's breath hitched. She instinctively reached up, her fingers closing around the familiar shape of the silver vulture. It was the only thing she owned in the world, a talisman she'd clung to through years of hardship. "It was a gift," she whispered. "From who?" Caleb's voice was sharp, a surgeon's knife trying to cut to the heart of the matter. Mara looked away, her gaze unfocused as she dredged up the murky, painful memories. "A woman. In the camp." Her voice was thin, fragmented. She was kind to me. She protected me from the others. From him. Him. The leader. Silas. The name came out like a shard of glass. She was his woman, I think, but she was different. She was sad. She used to look at the sky like she was waiting for something to fall out of it. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. Silas. He knew the name. A notoriously cruel bandit leader whose territory stretched across southern Wyoming. His sister. With a man like that? The thought was poison. "This woman," Caleb pressed, leaning forward, his intensity palpable in the small space. What did she look like? What was her name? I don't know her name. Everyone just called her Lark because she used to sing. Not happy songs. Sad ones. About a river. And a home she couldn't get back to. Mara's brow furrowed in concentration. She was sick. For a long time. The day before I ran. She gave me this. Mara clutched the pendant. She told me it would keep me safe. She said it was a piece of her soul, and that I had to take it far away. She pushed me out of the camp in the middle of the night. She told me to run, and never look back. Caleb felt a cold dread wash over him. The story didn't fit. It was all wrong. In his mind, his sister, Lily, was a prisoner, a victim awaiting rescue. But Mara's story painted a different picture. A woman who was part of the camp, who had been there for years, long enough to fall ill and waste away. A woman named Lark. That's not her name, he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. Mara flinched. It's what they called her. Her name was Lily, he said, his voice thick with a decade of grief. And she wouldn't just live with them. She wouldn't sing. The protest sounded weak even to his own ears. He was trying to force the world to fit his memory of a 10-year-old girl. He saw the confusion and hurt in Mara's eyes. She had shared the most painful piece of her past, and he had thrown it back at her. The fragile trust that had bloomed between them began to wither. Was she lying? Was she one of them? A plant sent to lead him into a trap? Or was the truth something far more complicated? Something his heart refused to accept? He sank back against the rock wall, the hope that had fueled his desperate rescue now curdling into doubt and a terrible, aching confusion. He had collapsed for a memory, risked his life for a ghost. But the girl huddled beside him, wearing his sister's necklace and his own coat, had just told him a story that suggested the ghost he was chasing had a different life, a different name, and a different, more tragic end than the one he had always imagined. Dawn broke cold and gray, the landscape shrouded in a thin, ethereal mist. The conversation from the night before hung between them, a wall of unspoken doubt and fractured hope. Caleb broke their meager camp with a grim efficiency, avoiding Mara's gaze. The coat was returned, the silence resumed, and they rode on, the weight of their troubled history heavier than any pursuer. Caleb's mind was a battlefield. One part of him clung desperately to the image of Lily, his innocent sister, a captive. The other, darker part, wrestled with Mara's story. Lark, a bandit's woman, a sad song about a river. It was a truth too monstrous to entertain, yet too specific to dismiss. He pushed them deeper into the Badlands, a maze of steep-walled canyons and treacherous scree slopes. It was a place that could swallow an army, a perfect landscape for an ambush. He knew it, and in his distraction, he missed the sign. A single, fresh horseshoe print in a patch of damp sand, half erased, but there. They were riding through a narrow chasm, the rock walls rising like monoliths on either side, when the first shot rang out. The bullet ricocheted off the canyon wall with a vicious whine, inches from Caleb's head. "Ambush!" he yelled, his voice raw. Instinct took over. He threw himself and Mara from the horse, tumbling into the relative cover of a rocky outcrop as another shot kicked up dust where they had just been. Dusty, panicked, bolted down the canyon. They were trapped. 3 men appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the pale sky. Bandits. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold. One of them, a burly man with a thick, dark beard, laughed. "Nowhere to run. Rancher, Silas wants the girl back, and he wants a word with the man who took her." Caleb shoved Mara deeper behind the rocks. "Stay down," he commanded, his rifle already at his shoulder. He wasn't a gunslinger, but he was a survivor. He squeezed the trigger, his shot aimed not to kill, but to suppress. The bullet chipped the rock near one of the men, forcing them to duck for cover. The canyon erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Bullets slammed into the rocks around them, sending stone splinters flying like shrapnel. It was brutal, terrifying, and intimate. Caleb fired methodically, conserving his ammunition, making every shot count. He felt a searing pain in his left arm and looked down to see blood soaking through his sleeve. A ricochet had grazed him. Mara, huddled behind him, wasn't screaming. Her face was pale with terror, but her eyes were focused. She watched him fire, reload, fire again. "Your rifle," she said, her voice tight. "The cartridges are in your saddlebag." He cursed under his breath. On the panicked horse, he only had a few rounds left. It was over. Just then, one of the bandits on the ridge grew impatient. He broke cover, trying to get a better angle. It was a fatal mistake. Caleb's rifle cracked, and the man fell backward out of sight. The bearded man roared in fury. "You'll pay for that!" He and the remaining bandit began to scramble down the scree slope, opting for a direct assault. It was what Caleb had been waiting for. A fight on his terms. As the first man slid into the canyon floor, Caleb was on him, his rifle used as a club. The fight was savage and close. It was all fists and grunts and the desperate struggle for survival. He managed to down the second man, but the bearded leader was strong. They wrestled in the dust, the man's hands reaching for Caleb's throat. From behind the rock, Mara emerged. In her hand was a heavy, jagged stone. With a cry that was part fear and part rage, she brought it down hard on the back of the bandit's head. He grunted, his grip loosening, and slumped onto Caleb. Caleb shoved the unconscious man off him, breathing heavily, his wounded arm throbbing. The second bandit he'd fought was groaning, trying to crawl away, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. Caleb limped over, his pistol now in his hand. He knelt beside the dying outlaw. "Your leader," Caleb gasped. "Silas, the woman he kept. Lark. Tell me about her." The man coughed, a bloody froth on his lips. He looked at Caleb with a strange, pitying sneer. "Lark, heh, you knew her." "Her name was Lily," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "She was my sister." The bandit's sneer turned into a weak, gurgling laugh. The sound was obscene in the sudden silence of the canyon. "Sister," he wheezed. "Oh, that's rich. Silas didn't steal her. You fool. She ran to him. Chose him over your dirt-scratchin' family. She wasn't our prisoner." He coughed again, his eyes glazing over. He looked past Caleb, at Mara, who stood frozen a few feet away. "She gave the brat the necklace herself," the outlaw whispered, his voice fading. "Her last gift, before Silas's temper finally put her in the ground." The words struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. The world tilted, the canyon walls seeming to close in on him. She ran to him, chose him. The carefully constructed narrative of his life, the righteous anger, the quest for his stolen sister, was not just wrong. It was a lie he had told himself for 10 years. He stared at the dead bandit, then at Mara, and finally at the blood on his own arm. The fight was over, but the truth, delivered by a dying killer, had just inflicted a wound far deeper than any bullet. The silence that followed the bandit's last words was a living thing, a heavy shroud that suffocated the air in the canyon. Caleb didn't move. He simply knelt in the dust next to the dead man, the outlaw's revelation echoing in his skull. She ran to him, chose him. The foundation of his entire adult life, the grief that had defined him, had crumbled into dust. It wasn't a story of abduction. It was one of betrayal, or something more complicated and painful than he could have ever conceived. Mara watched him, her heart aching for this broken man. The revelation had stunned her too. The kind woman, Lark, hadn't been a captive, but a willing participant in the outlaw life, a life that ultimately killed her. She took a tentative step toward Caleb. "Caleb?" He didn't seem to hear her. He finally pushed himself to his feet, his movements stiff and mechanical, like a clockwork man winding down. His eyes were hollow, devoid of the fire and purpose that had driven him. He looked at his wounded arm as if it belonged to someone else, then began to tear a strip from his shirt to create a makeshift bandage. His actions were automatic, the motions of a man trained for survival, even when his spirit had been dealt a mortal blow. There was only one place to go now, not forward, not back, but to the source of the wound itself. "We're going to my family's homestead," he announced, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It's not far. A day's ride." He retrieved his horse, which had thankfully not run far, and they rode in a profound silence. The landscape seemed to mirror Caleb's inner state, barren, broken, and haunted by ghosts. Mara said nothing, understanding that no words could touch the depth of his shock and disillusionment. They arrived at dusk. The homestead was a skeletal ruin, a testament to a long-ago tragedy. A single stone chimney stood defiant against the sky, a tombstone for a dead dream. The main house was a pile of charred timbers and collapsed walls, slowly being reclaimed by weeds and wildflowers. Caleb dismounted and walked through the ruins like a man in a trance, his boots crunching on scorched wood and broken crockery. This was the place where his world had ended. He remembered the smell of his mother's baking, the sound of his father's laughter, the sight of Lily chasing butterflies in the meadow. And he remembered the fire, the screams, the terror. He had believed it was all Silas's doing. But now, Mara followed him, her steps hesitant. As they neared the remains of a small root cellar near the back of the house, a flicker of memory sparked in her mind. A dark space, the smell of earth and fear, a small crack of light from above. "I've been here before," she whispered, her voice filled with a dawning, terrifying recognition. Caleb turned to her, his hollow eyes finally showing a flicker of life. "The night of the fire," Mara continued, her voice trembling as the fragmented images coalesced. "There was shouting, smoke, Lark, Lily. She grabbed me. She hid me. Down there." She pointed a shaking finger at the collapsed entrance to the root cellar. "She told me to be quiet, no matter what I heard. She gave me the necklace." Mara's eyes filled with tears as the final piece of the memory, the most important piece, fell into place. She kissed my forehead, and she said, "You are my hope, little bird. Survive. Be my memory." Caleb stared at her, his mind racing, piecing together this new, heartbreaking truth. Lily hadn't run to Silas out of malice. The story was far more complex. Perhaps she had been charmed by him, a young girl swept away by a dangerous man, only to realize her mistake too late. Trapped. She found a small orphan girl, Mara, and poured all her thwarted love and regret into protecting her. The raid on her own family's homestead wasn't something she'd planned. It was a disaster she was caught in. And in the heart of that chaos, Lily made a choice. She couldn't save herself, but she could save one small child. She hid Mara, entrusting her with the family heirloom, not as a sign of who Mara was, but as a message for the future, a promise that something good could survive the ashes. Caleb sank to his knees in the ruins of his home, the truth washing over him in a wave of unbearable grief and startling clarity. Mara was not his sister. She was his sister's last act, a living testament of love and sacrifice. His quest had not been a lie, just misunderstood. He had not been chasing a ghost to save her, but to fulfill her final wish. He looked at Mara, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a phantom of his past, but as the girl his sister had died to protect. A promise. And in the ruins of his old life, he found the seed of a new one, a duty not to the dead, but to the living. The journey away from the ruined homestead was different. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a shared, somber understanding. The ghosts had not been banished, but they had finally found their proper place. Caleb was no longer a man haunted by a lie, but one driven by a profound, inherited purpose. His grief for Lily was sharper now, purified by the truth of her sacrifice. His duty was clear. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about redemption, his sister's and his own. It was about ensuring Mara had the future Lily had paid for with her life. He knew where Silas would be. Men like him were creatures of habit and ego. After a failed ambush, he wouldn't retreat to his main camp. He'd go somewhere to lick his wounds and reassert his power. He would return to Rawlings. They rode into the trading town 2 days later, not as fugitives, but as arbiters of a long-overdue justice. Caleb left Mara in the relative safety of the town's small church, under the care of a bewildered but kind-hearted reverend. He made her a promise, his eyes meeting hers with a newfound clarity. "I will come back." It was not a hope. It was a statement of fact. Caleb found Silas where he knew he would be, in the town's grimiest saloon, surrounded by the sycophants and cronies who fed on his violent charisma. Silas was holding court, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, his laughter loud and arrogant. When Caleb stepped through the swinging doors, a hush fell over the room. Silas's eyes narrowed. He smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "Well, look what the wind blew in. The rancher with a death wish. I heard my men lost you. Careless of them." "They're dead," Caleb said, his voice level, carrying across the silent room. He didn't draw his pistol. This was not a gunfight to be won with speed. It was a reckoning. "They're always replaceable," Silas sneered, taking a swig from his bottle. "Just like the girl. And just like her protector." He was referring to Lily. The casual cruelty of his words was meant to provoke, to trigger a mistake. But Caleb did not rise to the bait. He took a slow step forward. "I know the truth. Silas, I know what she did. Her last act." Silas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "She was a sentimental fool." "She was a good woman trapped in a bad life," Caleb countered, his voice ringing with conviction. "And in the end, she chose the girl's future over yours. Her last act on this earth was to defy you, to save something innocent from your poison." Every word was a chip against Silas's armor of arrogance. Caleb was not just accusing him of murder, he was declaring him a failure. He was exposing him as the man who couldn't hold on to the one person who might have redeemed him. With a roar of pure rage, Silas kicked the table over and drew his gun. The saloon erupted in chaos, but Caleb was ready. His own pistol was in his hand, the movement fluid and certain. It wasn't the frantic exchange of the canyon. It was a grim, focused duel. 2 shots rang out, almost as one. Silas crumpled to the floor, his chest stained with a spreading red bloom, his face a mask of shock. Caleb stood, a searing pain in his side where Silas's bullet had torn through flesh, but he remained upright. The fight was over. The cycle was broken. He walked out of the saloon, leaving the silence and the staring faces behind him. He stumbled toward the church, his strength fading, but his purpose held him up. He found Mara waiting on the steps, her face pale with worry. When she saw the blood, she ran to him, helping him sit on the steps. He looked at her, his vision blurring slightly. "It's done," he whispered. "You're free." But they both knew it was more than that. He hadn't just secured her freedom, he had secured his own, free from the ghosts of the past, free from the lie that had consumed him. As Mara tended to his wound, her touch gentle and sure, he looked at her face, seeing not the shadow of his sister, but the bright, resilient spirit of a young woman with a future. In the dusty streets of a Wyoming town, surrounded by the wreckage of their pasts, they were no longer a rancher and a fugitive. They were two survivors, a new kind of family, forged not in blood, but in the ashes of a shared loss and the unbreakable promise of a new dawn. The Wyoming wind carries stories, whispering them through the canyons and across the endless plains. It remembers the legends of gunslingers and the sagas of cattle kings, but it also holds the quieter tales, the ones about ordinary people pushed to extraordinary limits. The story of Caleb and Mara is one of those. It is not a tale of grand conquest, but of quiet redemption. It speaks to the truth that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build from the broken pieces of our lives. It is a testament to the fact that the deepest wounds can be healed, not by vengeance, but by fulfilling a promise to protect what is good and hopeful in the world. Their life was not easy. They rebuilt the homestead, not as it was, but as something new, its foundations laid on a painful truth but cemented with mutual respect and a quiet, resilient love. The ghosts of the past never truly left. They simply became a part of the landscape, like the distant mountains, a reminder of the price that had been paid for their peace. Caleb never stopped missing the sister he had lost, but in caring for Mara, in watching her grow into a strong and compassionate woman, he honored Lily's memory more than any act of revenge ever could have. He had found his purpose not in correcting the past, but in building a future worthy of his sister's sacrifice. And in the vast, wild heart of the West, they found not just survival, but a home